ELT Research Bites, your delightful dose of discovery.
Hello and welcome to ELT Research Bites, your delightful dose of discovery. I'm Natalie Wong. Here we dive deep into the core of important research in applied linguistics and ELT, making it easy and quick to understand. For today, we're going to bite into an interesting study about the insights and the implementation of the CEFR, essentially in Thailand. Let's dive in.
You know that feeling when you're learning a new language, like English, and you get to the point where you need to show what you can do? Maybe for university or a job or, just to see how far you've come.
Absolutely. It almost always means some kind of test, some framework.
Exactly. And how we measure that ability, the standards we use, well, it's incredibly important and actually quite complex, as our sources today show.
It really is. It's not as simple as just getting a score.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've got a stack of sources here giving us different angles on assessing English proficiency.
Yeah, looking especially at how this plays out in Asia and using the common European framework of reference, the CEFR, as a kind of anchor.
Right. We're digging into research that looks at how universities actually build their own standardized tests.
And also how students see their own skills, through self-assessment. Plus, we're taking a step back to look at the bigger picture, the trends in language assessment research globally.
So our mission today is to unpack these sources together. We'll pull out the most important insights, maybe some surprising facts about how English proficiency gets measured and understood, especially with the CEFR.
And this deep dive is tailored for you, the listener, to help you get informed quickly but thoroughly.
Okay, let's get started then.
Great.
Okay, let's unpack this, the CEFR. You've probably seen those codes A1, B2, C1, maybe on a textbook or a course description. What is this framework, really, and why is it so, everywhere?
So at its core, the CEFR is basically a standard scale. It describes language ability, developed initially by the Council of Europe.
For Europe, originally.
Yes, to help people understand language qualifications across borders, promote mobility, that sort of thing. It goes from A1, total beginner, up to C2, which is considered mastery. But the key thing, I think, was its focus on can-do statements.
Can-do statements.
Yeah. What can a learner actually do with the language? Not just, do they know this grammar rule, but can they order food? Can they follow a meeting? Real-world tasks.
That makes a lot more sense. Practical application.
Exactly. And that practical approach is probably why it's been picked up or adapted way beyond Europe. We see it used quite a bit in Asia, Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, China.
And one of the sources mentioned a Japanese version, CEFRJ.
Yes, that's a perfect example of adaptation. The CEFRJ adds these plus levels in between, like A1 plus C, A2 plus C.
So smaller steps.
Smaller steps, exactly.
Yeah.
Especially useful at those lower levels where progress can feel slow. It helps learners see they're moving forward, which is great for motivation.
Okay. And has the main CEFR itself stayed static, or has it evolved?
Oh, it's definitely evolved. There was a significant update in 2018. One really interesting shift was moving away from the idea of the native speaker as the benchmark.
How so?
Well, it now talks about speakers of the target language. It's a nod to the fact that English is used in so many diverse ways globally. There isn't just one correct way anymore.
That feels more realistic.
It does. They also gave more prominence to something called mediation.
Mediation. What does that mean in language terms?
Think of it like being a communication bridge. It covers things like summarizing a text for someone, relaying information between people who might not understand each other directly, explaining a concept you've learned.
Okay, so it combines understanding and explaining, maybe even across languages.
Precisely. It's about facilitating communication, acting as that link. It combines reception, production, interaction. It's very holistic.
Sounds complex to test, though.
It absolutely is. Capturing that kind of fluid, interactive process in a standardized test, that's a major challenge for test designers.
Right. And there's another tension, isn't there? The CEFR philosophy feels flexible, focused on can-do. But when you slap a test score on it and say, okay, you're B1 based on a cutoff, that feels really fixed.
That's a really key point. The framework itself suggests competence depends on context. It's not uniform. But the practical application through testing often requires drawing these hard lines between levels, which can feel quite rigid compared to the can-do spirit.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How do institutions actually make these tests? How do they try and connect them to something like the CEFR? Our sources give us some concrete examples from Thailand.
Yeah, this is the nitty-gritty. One study gives a very detailed account of developing the RSU TEP, the Rangsit University English Proficiency Test.
RSU TEP, okay.
They went through this 6-stage process, really systematic, planning, designing, and writing the items, expert review, piloting it with students, revising based on the data, and then a final tryout.
6 stages. Sounds thorough. How did they make sure the questions were right for different student levels?
Well, they grouped the students for the piloting phase based on the English courses they were already in. So you had beginners from a prep course, intermediate from foundation courses, and advanced students from more specialized programs.
Ah, so they tested the items across the range they intended the test for.
Exactly. It helped ensure the items functioned properly at different ability levels.
And what was the test like? What did it cover?
It was computer-based, 100 multiple-choice questions in 90 minutes. It had 3 sections: listening, structure and expressions, and reading comprehension.
Okay. And I think the source mentioned listening got the most weight.
It did, yeah. More questions, more time.
Why was that?
Their reasoning was twofold. 1, listening skills were heavily emphasized in their university courses, reflecting their communicative teaching style.
Makes sense.
And 2, they pointed to just how important listening is in today's world, with multimedia everywhere. It was a conscious decision based on their priorities.
Okay, so they built the test carefully. But how did they check if it was actually a good test, reliable, valid?
And the crucial checks. For validity, making sure it measures what it claims to measure. They did several things. They used CEFR resources to guide item writing. They had items reviewed by experts, people with master's degrees in English language teaching, 10+ years of experience.
Serious experts.
Definitely. And they used a formal process called an item objective congruency test, basically getting the experts to rate how well each question matched the learning objectives. Items had to score well to be kept.
Yeah. So the experts agreed the questions were on target. What about reliability? Consistency.
They used statistical analysis for that. They ran the pilot test data through an item analysis tool. The first draft already had pretty good reliability, a KR20 coefficient of 0.88.
Which is quite high.
It is. But after they analyzed how difficult each item was and how well it discriminated between stronger and weaker students, they revised some items. And the final version reached a reliability of 0.94.
Wow, that's very high. Shows the revision process worked.
It does. It means the test scores were very dependable.
Okay, that's a clear picture of building a test from the ground up.
Yeah.
Now, we also have a source looking at validating just one part, the reading section of another university's test, the KKU AELT at Konkane University.
Right. This one focused specifically on the reading part of their test for graduate applicants, and they wanted to see how it aligned with the B levels of the CEFR.
So a slightly different angle validating an existing section against the framework. What was their method?
They also used expert judges, experienced English lecturers. But critically, these experts first went through training workshops specifically on understanding and applying the CEFR descriptors for reading.
So they made sure everyone was on the same page about what B1 or B2 reading actually means, according to the CEFR.
Exactly. Consistency was key. Then these trained experts analyzed the test's reading passages and questions using a detailed CEFR grid. They checked inter-rater reliability, how well the experts agreed with each other, and it was high.
Okay, so the experts could reliably apply the CEFR scale. What did they find about the reading passages themselves?
It was quite interesting. The texts came from journals, announcements, newspapers, pretty standard academic and public sources. But when they analyzed the vocabulary, and the large chunk of it was actually at the A1 or A2 level, quite basic words.
Really? For a graduate level test?
Yeah, over 50% was A1 vocab. But, and this is crucial, when they looked at the grammar used in the sentences, that skewed much higher, mostly B1 and B2.
Okay.
And the overall text complexity, considering things like organization and concepts, was estimated mostly at B2, with some B1 and even C1.
So that shows you can't just judge difficulty by vocabulary alone. Simple words can be used in complex ways.
Precisely. Sentence structure, how ideas connect, that makes a huge difference. The actual questions tested typical academic reading skills, finding facts, summarizing, guessing vocab from context, making inferences, standard stuff, but mapped to the CEFR levels.
So both these studies show incredible detail goes into developing and validating tests against the CEFR. But what were the big challenges they highlighted?
A recurring theme is the fuzziness, the ambiguity in some of the CEF descriptors themselves.
Like what?
Well, you have phrases like can understand simple texts or can follow the main points of complex arguments. What counts as simple or complex, it can be subjective.
I see. It's hard to draw a precise line.
Exactly. Even trained experts sometimes struggle to clearly distinguish between adjacent levels, like, say, a high B2 versus a low C1 reading ability. It can lead to subjective judgments.
So the framework's flexibility can be a weakness when it comes to standardized measurement.
In a way, yes. The sources suggest that maybe the CEFR itself could benefit from more concrete examples or clearer guidelines to help with this interpretation. And one source makes a really important point. Just mapping test scores onto the CEFR isn't enough for true validation.
What else is needed?
Empirical evidence.
Yeah.
You need proof that performing well on the test actually predicts how someone uses the language successfully in real life. That link back to real-world competence is vital.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the tests themselves. What about the learners? How do they see their own abilities? We have a study looking at CEFR-based self-assessment.
Right. This brings in a totally different student-centered perspective. Self-assessment is interesting because it's often framed as assessment as learning.
As learning, how so?
Because the act of reflecting on what you can and can't do, thinking about your strengths and weaknesses, is actually part of the learning process itself. It gets you thinking about your own learning.
Ah, metacognition. Thinking about thinking.
Exactly. And the claimed benefits are pretty wide-ranging. Promoting critical thinking, learner autonomy, building self-efficacy, that belief in your own ability.
Which can boost motivation.
Definitely. It can increase interest and motivation. And practically, it can be a useful way for students to gauge their readiness before taking a big formal test.
So how did this specific study investigate self-assessment?
They developed a questionnaire with 40 can-do statements based on the CEFR B1 and B2 levels. It was bilingual, English, and Thai, which is helpful. Undergrad students in Thailand filled this out before taking their university's English proficiency test.
And what did the students think about their own skills? Was there a pattern?
Yes, quite a clear one. Students generally rated their productive skills speaking and writing as lower, more towards the B1 level, but they tended to rate their receptive skills, listening and reading higher, closer to B2.
Why might that be? Did this study suggest reasons?
It did. The researchers proposed it might relate to opportunities for practice outside the classroom in that specific Thai context. Students might get lots of passive exposure, listening to music, watching movies, reading online.
Right, lots of input.
Exactly. But fewer chances to actively produce language, to practice speaking or writing in authentic situations. So even if their underlying ability is more balanced, their confidence and productive skills might be lower.
That's fascinating. Confidence versus measured skill. Did their self-ratings actually match their test scores?
There was a correlation, yes, but it was described as moderate. For example, the link between self-assessed writing and the writing test score was positive, but only around 0.35.
So it predicts performance a bit, but it's not a perfect mirror.
Not at all. It suggests self-assessment gives some indication, especially perhaps in low-stakes situations, but you wouldn't rely on it solely for high-stakes decisions.
What makes self-assessment more accurate or less accurate, according to the research?
Well, the clarity of the statements on the questionnaire is crucial. Vague can-do statements lead to vague self-assessments.
Makes sense.
Other factors include whether students have actually been trained or guided on how to self-assess effectively. Lack of teacher feedback on their self-assessments can also be an issue. And interestingly, learner proficiency itself plays a role.
How so?
Higher proficiency learners often tend to be more accurate in judging their own abilities compared to beginners.
I see. And maybe a mismatch between the general CEFR description and the specific test tasks.
Yes, that too. If the self-assessment asks about general communication, but the test focuses on very specific academic skills, the correlation might be weaker.
So the takeaway is that self-assessment is a really valuable tool for building awareness, for motivation.
Absolutely. For fostering learner autonomy.
But its accuracy as a pure measurement tool depends heavily on clear criteria, good preparation, maybe teacher guidance. It's not typically a replacement for formal assessment.
Precisely. It serves a different but equally important purpose in the learning journey.
So what does this all mean? We've looked at the big framework, the CEFR, the detailed work of building tests, the student perspective through self-assessment, and the challenges in making it all align. Let's pull back now and look at the wider trends. Where is language assessment research heading?
Yeah, looking at the big picture is helpful. One source analyzed research trends over time. It showed a real boom in English language assessment research starting around the early 90s, but then a significant acceleration from about 2006 onwards.
Why them?
It seems strongly linked to globalization and English solidifying its role as the global lingua franca. As more people needed and used English, the need to understand how to assess it effectively just grew exponentially.
And what are the hot topics within that research?
Key areas getting a lot of focus include writing assessment, which is always complex self-assessment like we just discussed, and also issues around bilingualism and multilingualism.
That connects to what you said earlier about the CEFR moving away from the native speaker idea.
Exactly. There's a broader shift in the whole language education field away from that rigid native and non-native distinction. The conversation now is much more about world Englishes, global Englishes.
Recognizing the diversity.
Recognizing the diversity and validity of how English is used by billions of speakers worldwide, challenging that old idea of a single monolithic standard.
How does that changing view impact how we think about assessing English?
It pushes the field to think about more inclusive and realistic approaches. One concept gaining traction is translanguaging.
We mentioned that briefly with the CEFR update, the mediation part.
Yes, it's related. Translanguaging views multilingual speakers not as having separate languages stored in boxes in their heads, but as having one integrated linguistic repertoire.
So they draw on everything they know, bits of different languages to communicate.
Exactly. They use all their linguistic resources fluidly. So a translanguaging approach to assessment would try to capture that. It wouldn't just test English in isolation. It would look at how learners use their entire repertoire to achieve a communicative goal.
Okay, so maybe assessing how well someone explains a concept, using English primarily, but perhaps clarifying a key term in another language if needed, and seeing that as effective communication.
Potentially, yes. The argument is that this could lead to more valid assessments, measuring what people actually do, and fair assessments, especially for multilingual learners. It reflects reality better.
Are there other new directions?
Another important one is dynamic assessment. This comes out of sociocultural theory.
Dynamic assessment, meaning not static.
Pretty much. Instead of just a snapshot, what can the learner do right now, alone, dynamic assessment involves interaction between the assessor and the learner during the assessment.
How does that work?
The assessor might provide prompts, hints, or feedback to see how the learner responds and learns within the assessment context. The focus shifts from just the final product to the learning process and the learner's potential for development.
So it's measuring potential, not just current performance.
Exactly. It aligns with the idea that learning happens through social interaction and is influenced by context. So both translanguaging and dynamic assessment suggest moving away from traditional, isolated, static tests.
Towards more interactive, process-oriented, context-aware assessments.
That seems to be the direction, more holistic.
And thinking about the classroom, impact the washback effect, where tests influence teaching. How might these trends change teaching?
Well, if assessments start valuing translanguaging and dynamic interaction, it could encourage teachers to use more flexible, authentic tasks in the classroom. Think collaborative projects, problem-solving tasks, maybe presentations where drawing on multiple languages is okay, or where the focus is on the process of figuring things out together.
So less teaching to the test in the narrow sense, and more fostering broader communicative competence.
That would be the hope. Shifting assessment could help shift teaching towards practices that better reflect multilingual realities and support holistic language development.
Wow. Okay, that brings us through quite a journey. We've gone from global frameworks like the CEFR down into the real weeds of building and validating specific university tests.
Right, seeing the immense effort and the challenges involved in that alignment.
Then we look through the students' eyes via self-assessment, seeing how their perceptions and confidence fit into the picture.
And finally, pulling back to see these broader research trends pushing towards more dynamic, inclusive, and maybe more realistic ways of thinking about language ability.
It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Measuring something as fluid and multifaceted as language proficiency. Frameworks like the CEFR give us structure, a common language.
But they have limitations. Translating those broad descriptors into reliable test items that work across diverse contexts is genuinely difficult, as those studies showed with issues like descriptor ambiguity.
And self-assessment adds another layer valuable for learning, but not always a perfect measure of proficiency itself.
Yeah, it reminds us that the learner's internal state, their confidence, their awareness is part of the equation too.
So while standardized tests clearly have a role, providing benchmarks and standardized data.
The sources collectively suggest the field is grappling with how to better capture the full picture, especially as global English use becomes even more diverse and dynamic. How do we assess communication in multilingual contexts effectively?
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. If language in the real world is constantly shifting, adapting, blending across boundaries, how can assessment truly keep pace? How do we design ways to measure that complex, dynamic ability without forcing it into overly rigid boxes?
What would assessment look like if it genuinely embraced multilingualism, focused on communicative effectiveness in real contexts, and valued learning potential as much as current performance? Something to think about.
ELT Research Bites. Your delightful dose of discovery.